Thank you, Alex, and thank you very much for that. Makes me feel old, I suppose, old and but maybe experienced to some extent. I'm just going to quickly go straight into sharing my screen, just to give people a look at what I'm on about, and I'm going to go to there and bring up my page there. If I can start by saying thank you to Auntie Georgina for that welcome to country from where she's down there in Naarm. I've worked with the Wurundjeri people quite extensively on a showcase at the Ian Potter Gallery, which represented their deep connection to country in that region of that capital city. I might also say, from my own perspective, I'm a Cooma Māori from Western Queensland, but I was born in Sydney at Blacktown. I have a strong love of the Sydney region, and I've been exploring the connection to country of the local people down there, particularly the Gadigal people around the Sydney CBD. But having said that, many of the projects that you'll see within the Indigiverse span the entire country. And in that way, this is really just a storytelling platform. What might be that First Nations people say about their close affinity to the land, to its waters, and to the stories that permeate throughout. It's very hard in this short time to sort of give you the length and breadth of what this all means, but I want to say, from an archaeological point of view, I really love the industry. It is tantamount and fundamental and vital to First Nations people. The rigour that goes into the analysis of our connection to country is so important in terms of how it determines our native title rights, our land rights originally, our native title rights, and furthermore within the areas of cultural heritage. So I just think I just want to be part of that. I want to be a positive player, a contributor, and I love the technology that can do this. If you look at Indigiverse, and I'm describing that, I'm trying to say this is a vehicle for First Nations people. I might be the person, in a sense, driving or paddling the canoe, let's just say, or the Nowie, if you want to call it the Nowie, which is a name that the Sydney mob use for that water device, that hopefully the one that doesn't sink. But this is what this is about. This is about those moments, those sites, and those objects of cultural significance. So if you look at the website, this website that you can go to, which is about the project, is really a web app. So I want to present my work in this way. It goes through some detail about what it's about. And if anybody who's following on wants to know where to go, it's the website there, and you can follow on about what we're doing. This site that you're seeing here changes daily. It's a constant evolution. And I can describe the importance of it from a cultural heritage landscape perspective, for its importance to recognise and reimagine the traditional, I suppose, welcome or acknowledgement of country, but in a tangible way using digital technologies. I have been following what I call the advancement of Australia since 1788. And as you watch that advancement, there's been certain ways that that's happened. And from that, First Nations people have been slowly dispossessed to a point. They've fought for their rights at many occasions. And then in the more recent times, we're trying to reassert a connection to country. If you speak to many First Nations people, they approach that from I would say a game theory basis, based on, I suppose you would say, mutual respect and reconciliation, also from a position of greater understanding. And then the last point in that, if you know game theory, is but be assertive in that defence of your connection to country in the wake of many things. Now, when I say in the wake of many things, what I'm trying to say here with the work I do is that we're trying to do this virtual songlines to align with a 10D geospatial digital platform arrangement. Now, 10D is a geoscience or a GIS-based framework. And if you think about what's going on in present government services, like geospatial services with the Queensland government, they tend to have that sort of rigour in the way they would do their cadastral, their geographic systems, their place names, and their administration or administrative authority. If anybody knows about this space, there's a whole lot of work being done right at this moment in the refactoring of the Queensland Globe website in Australia. And I think that will be the driver for many other states to fall in line with that rigour. When I do that, and I think about that, and with all the TOs that are there trying to, embed their perspectives in anything that's going on in the land around them, in capital cities, regional towns, and the like, there's always a archaeological approach. There's a mapping approach. There is what are those tangible heritage values. But having said that, there's sometimes a lack of recognition of the intangible heritage values. So if I come in here, this is my next section that you can see, and I will go through this saying this. In a capital city like Melbourne, we did a project for Virtual NAM, which was a 65,000-year exhibition at the Potter Gallery in Melbourne. It couldn't be achieved, this work, without a deeply contextualised cultural heritage knowledge endorsed and vetted by the local custodians, the Wurundjeri that you just heard the Welcome to Country from. Now, this Virtual NAM is just one example of many that we're doing. Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and then there's many regional towns we've dealt with, and in various ways and shapes. It's not the only way to tell a story. This is a media of a type, virtual heritage, and I think that's important to note. If I come back through here, what this all leads into, from my perspective, and what I've been hearing, is that there's a need for authenticity, but also truth-telling. Many First Nations people, and you've heard Auntie Georgina mention, state and say that sovereignty's never been ceded. Well, that sovereignty, or that personification of sovereignty, is through oral histories, saying that we continue to have that connection through linguistic data, where we start to look at place names for locations, and also languages that define and describe and talk about that connection to country. And then the archaeological evidence. This is where the academic rigour, the sort of experts that come in there and help to argue and prove and showcase that millennia of occupation. And it feeds into many things like resource management outcomes, and like ceremony grounds, burial sites, hearths, scatters, and the like. The things that then get shown as physical evidence. Now, I think they're all great and important things, but where we want to go a little bit further is, how do we visualize those locations? How does each location that is explored by any vast array of archaeologists across this vast land of ours, then I suppose publish that work, present that work, and that's where Virtual Songlines is looking to the virtual heritage art. If I could just pause for a minute on that and mention, if I bring that down and I'm out of the way, I'm saying there's a history of this. This map you're seeing here, this is a map of Brisbane, and it was a recreating a managed landscape. It's a mapping project, and in here there's coloured icons that you can notice, and there's white icons. The white icons that you're seeing on this map are diary entries, written reports, say newspaper articles about a First Nations activity, and that by non-Indigenous people. But the coloured ones are Indigenous authorised stuff, and that's the differentiation on that map. We've done, I said 50 projects. We've actually done 140 maps in this style. Now, this map is an old map. I think we first started exploring this map in May, around about, it might have been not May, but maybe the month after June, June 1993. And at the time I was with the National Indigenous Media Association, which was looking to be the voice of our people. If you hear the call over my headphones, I'm actually about to fly to Morocco to do a talk with First Nations people. But having said that, in the media sector, we were looking at what ways can we use media to amplify and share those stories about our advancement, our continued existence, and our life in this space. And that was the formation of a national body, a national association of First Nations broadcasters and media operators, filmmakers, and the like. I think media is something that First Nations people took on to what they say. I think the word was back then, or the phrase was, to fight fire with fire. And understanding that was so important. And it goes on and on from that perspective. At the time, I remember back in 1993, or towards the end of that year, a professor from Griffith University called Dr. Olaf Moon visited us and talked about the new cooperative multimedia centre. And he was talking about this because at the same time there was this growing field of people looking at digital technologies for archaeology. Okay, and from there was 3 universities doing stuff. Carnegie Mellon. I'm probably telling people what they already know here, but I'll just mention that we were hearing this stuff back then, and where we were first moved was where they talked about the design of what they call the Temple of Horus, which was an interactive entertainment learning site by I think a man called I don't think his name, Bill Reisman, I think, and Donald Sanders. I think some people can look that up and see if I'm right on that one. But those 2 people were looking to recreate ancient Egypt. So now when you hear that, and we're First Nations people, we're sort of very competitive. We thought, well, those pyramids are what, 4,000 years old? We argue in Australia that we've got a 65,000 year connection to country. So therefore that was like red rag to a bull. And we wanted to stand up and say, well, we can do better. And that's where because I was a lover of computers back then, and I used to play a game called Doom. And then I was thinking, well, if they can make a game in Doom like that, how can we not use that same metaphor to then represent the mythical beings that formed and created Australia in the same media? And that's sort of where this project of digital, well, back then it was called Digital Songlines, and cyber dreaming was the first terminology into this present day thing. So it's a long pathway. I can go into 1994 and meeting up with a guy who did a thing called VRML, and then there was other things that went from there. And then 1996, I remember going to a SIGGRAPH conference in Brisbane, and it was quite exciting to see what computer graphics could do. And at the SIGGRAPH conference, I met SGI. So that then allowed me to think and to dream and to imagine what was possible. That Dr. Olaf Moon's project got up. It was called Quantum CMC, the Cooperative Multimedia. That was a Queensland Northern Territory Multimedia Association. That those 2 bodies with the various rock arts that were so important, and also the Arnhem Land connection just seemed like an easy win for the federal government to support a big investment. And with that dollar that came out of that, we bought one of those very, very powerful big blue boxes from SGI, if anybody knows SGI. And we had to learn very fast how to code, very fast, and I was at the forefront of that. Not saying I was good, but I think I got better. And I think we can even be better today knowing where things are going. So I just wanted to say that short few things. And I believe at the time, I was throwing around a term called virtual heritage at that moment. And I presented cyber dreaming at that point and then spoke about virtual heritage. And of course, I think it was a year earlier that someone coined the phrase virtual archaeology. And that was Mario Forte, I believe, or Forte, and Silvio Salotti. they published a paper back there in 1997, and from there I could see the synergies here. So that's where, so here we are now, many decades later, and Virtual Songlines has morphed into a geospatial mapping system, which then explores concepts of the multiverse, I think, what I was calling it then, and then of course it went, Meta then, or Facebook stole that and then started to talk about the multiverse, or the metaverse, I should call it. So there you go. So that's that part of it. I want to go furthermore and say the goal of when we did the NAM stuff, coming back to the modern day, and one of the important things that was coming out of that was the stories of the land. And the stories of the land are so important. So I've said this, the embodied experiences of cultural transmission, but the stories of the land, I think, from a virtual heritage perspective, comes back to soundscapes, interactive soundscapes. And naturally that comes into the question of reconstruction of languages, traditional songs, animal sounds, and environmental ambience. Social structures can also be panned out through this. And these sort of kinship system, clan groups, movement patterns, and the like. I think this can work quite well in this media. If you want to go back to a more simpler form, or not, I shouldn't say simpler form, but a more abstract form, it would be the art, the desert art movement. That you would see great artworks from that. But I don't think that the art or the radio broadcast or the present TV, I think they're all progressions to where I think we're going with this new digital technology perspective, and how we then take that form, or those forms, into what I call an edutainment type of way, and this is where we're at here. So I think with all this stuff, the process of data gathering, the use of it as important as the data itself, and the metaphor of the landscape in a digital form is also important, and it has ramifications for traditional owners respecting local protocols, and then it starts to stem into these. I'll just give you these terms because these terms can be explored at some length. First Nations data sovereignty, principles of care, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibilities, ethics, and then the OCAP stuff in terms of what that means. So I'm just saying these terms because they are all things we consider. That work on the left there is a work we graffitied onto the Opera House. I produced that for just to make a statement about First Nations people being resilient, still here, and then blazing the trail for others to follow. Banbury, Barangaroo, Pemulwuy, and Padagarang. Padagarang gave us words like wallaby, possum, boomerang in her recital of language recorded by a guy called William Dawes back then in 1790. That's a story in itself. But we go further. So that's that part of it. Importance of cultural heritage for data for that. That's one part of my theme. The next part I wanted to go to, which I think is relevant for all of us now from a mapping perspective, is geospatial frameworks for First Nations truth-telling. I started looking at this as well, and how I can integrate, the complex data structures. And I think this is vital in terms of how we might then start to visualise intangible cultural heritage. Now, if anybody's aware, I'm sure many of you would be aware of the Burra Charter, a UN principle about respecting intangible heritage values as well as tangible heritage values. The intangible heritage values, I tend to feel, never gets really respected when there's a major infrastructure project going on across the country. And so I take it upon myself to talk with my allies, First Nations people, most definitely local people, about any of those projects and how they can play a part, respecting both their tangible as well as intangible heritage values. They're the stories of the land, what connects you to that, what are the sites of significance, and that comes back to a serious mapping approach. So that's that part of it. I want to sort of look at that, and I start to explore this from what I call a 10D which is an industry standard approach, but then I've taken the 10D standards and then made it a First Nations perspective. In this, the physical dimensions of sites becomes the 3D. The historical evolution over time is the 4D. And that means that we're starting to conceptualize more deeper intangible layers. I hope this makes sense, but this is here for other people to unpack down the track. And in that regard, I think that's where we start to go into the spiritual and cosmological law, the dreaming stories, the landscape, the sacred meaning, and ecological knowledge that reflects that connection to country. That is identity. That is important. And I think identity is something that we really need to give to many First Nations people, because that loss of that is where you tend to not really feel you've got a purpose. So acknowledging the stories, relations, spiritual significance, I think is very real and vital as a physical ground itself. Going further, I start to look at, there's my analysis of that in some detail. The 1 to 3D and site specific. Again, that map's a relevant map, and I'll go into some detail about that map. Those are obviously mapped within our digital twin. I've started to look at the 4D aspect. I mentioned time just earlier, but this is where I start to think about deep time and everywhen. I call the word everywhen. I think that's probably a good word for the dream time in that way. And how do we use that? This concept here that I'm showing on the image is basically a similar visualization that was done by NASA to represent a black hole. And I think that theory of a black hole is an interesting way to explore ways that we could show movement between present day and the past in an everyday and everywhen format. So that's one of my challenges, to see how we can actually present that in a three-dimensional, real-time way, moving from present to the past, and probably not the future, because that's a bit hard in terms of time. But that gives you an idea of what we're thinking, and what I've got a number of champions starting to explore, champions that I'll show you on the map that I have starting to map for that purpose. The 5D I call the ecology, the spirit of the land. In the ecology, if you break that down, that becomes the analysis or the metadata that relates to, say, bush foods and bush medicines. If I just, one point about the 4D, 3D, and 6D, and you'll see the other dimensions that I want to present in this part of my talk. These are all in a sense commercializable, because in a 10D framework that fits to the construction industry, the spatial industries industry, there is always an economics outcome to that. There's a financial outcome. So we want to look at that same thing. Bush foods, in a sense, are important for connection to country, but also bush foods are also about sustaining a group, food and medicinal resources. And there's an IP that attaches to that. I think you've heard, or some of you would have heard quite a bit about how foods and medicines could be used for medicinal values, and there's obviously clinical analysis of botany that could save lives to some extent, and that does happen. But beyond that, there's still a millennia of stories about foods used for medicinal purposes that comes out of the ecology of the land. Which you'll find too in the wake of urban expansion, sometimes clears that land. We know that it's occurring in many countries around the world, particularly Brazil, if we want to look at that. Coming further, I've gone into a 6D, and I call this naming. So place naming and language. That's a sixth dimension. In a sense, it's a spatial concept. So this layer goes beyond simple translation, revealing that a place is rarely just a label. Instead, it often functions as a detailed description, an instruction, or a story encoded in vital information about a resource, seasonal indicator. So these dimensional explanations I'm giving you here are all very much related indicators of connection, landscape, ancestral events, cultural protocols associated with specific location. And we're trying to map that within the context of virtual songlines. Going forward further, there's the 70. This is the kinship social relations. I think Auntie Georgia spoke to that matter in that, but I think there's a formality here that could go into this critical layer, making the invisible social landscape visible. She did that through images, but then there's also in her talks a temporal aspect to that too. You know, when, where, how, and what decisions happened at a moment that put somebody on a certain path somewhere. So that comes into that. And of course, there's obligations that relate to that, which I'm trying to mention here. This is very detailed and quite a long lot of work here, but it gives you a bit more to that. And then there's this 8D, which becomes the law. Now, 8D, this is relating to traditional law and custom, but from the same token, from a mainstream approach within say the Queensland Globe and what it does, it has a administration authority layer, and I think that comes into a law-based arrangement. How do they charge for a lease or prior to that, when you're talking about place names, your place name might be your address where you live. How does that address where you live then, trigger a whole lot of administration authorities billing you for certain things, like your rates, or a lease for a mine, or royalty payments based on the exploration of or exploitation of a resource within that mine, or whatnot. Or once there's a rail line in place, how does people from that rail line use? You would rent a small moment that allows you to travel from A to B. Those sort of things all come into that spatial relationships, and I'm trying to take that law and custom and into a protocol, rights, responsibility, which connects people, places and resources. When I say the word resources, I'm meaning trade. How was a volcanic glass speed tip traded from one location to another? How do those stories connect and travel across the country? Where are those pathways? And that is a huge data collection task, and also a relationship to land task. That's that part of the 8D law. Then I've gone into this 9D. This is where you get into this spirituality and dreaming. If I can just pause for a minute, and this, I wanted, and I will do an infographic about these dimensional layers. But if you look at it, probably the best metaphor for this would be, I think people would know this one, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as I'm progressing through this, I'm going through the basic into the more, I suppose, self-actualizing. All right, so spirituality and dreaming is probably at the top of the pile here, and something I want to show here in foundational, where the metaphysical reality of country is so important and personified within each person who plays a role within that, and in modern times that is shown by dance. Yesterday I was in Sydney at the Bangarra Dance Studios. If anybody has been to Australia or knows the Bangarra Dance group, they the head curator of that place was the curator for the opening ceremony for the Sydney Olympics in 2000, and Stephen Page and the Page family have been vital to that place being as vibrant and productive in terms of the way that it tells stories of spirituality, dreaming, connection to country at the highest level. So that particular group is a modern day personification of ceremony, of the recognition of the dreaming and where that goes and belongs in country. So this dimension ensures country is understood not just as a physical or social space, but as a living, conscious and sacred entity. So I think that is what we're trying to achieve in some way in the work we do, and in many, many ways. And lastly, overall, I'm trying to, let me just, I think overall this stuff, if it is able to be executed and done, and we do it with, with the lead from many groups across the country. This is where health and well-being is achieved. So my innovation, or this innovation, applies dimensionality to a profound First Nation understanding and recognition of the health and well-being of the continent. Then when you say the health and well-being of the continent, and with a First Nation connection to that, there's so many things that come from that. And that includes how we might burn, cultural burning that happens, coal burning that happens, the role of land and sea ranges that are happening, particularly in and around the east coast of Australia and inland too. One of the great challenges supported by CSIRO from this perspective is the Healthy Waterways program, which is looking at every single river that flows into the Pacific Ocean and into those areas, and how those waters are presently being looked after, if at all. So it is a role for many land and sea rangers to actually take that challenge on, to be custodian for the waters. It's one thing to say we have an editorial right to that, but an editorial right is only one thing. We need to then look at where those are, where the waters are, and what their healthy treatment is. And in a sense, there is a role for First Nations people, and particularly the Land and Sea Ranger programs, to do that, to perform that. And that in itself is a cultural mapping process. And in that, when you talk about that from an archaeological point of view, where were the activities that occurred through those rivers over time? Where were the fish traps? If anybody is online knows about the Barorona fish traps, there's a story in that which intrinsically links people to culture, to each other, to the role as custodians and also guardians, and when groups come together, potentially allies, and the linkages that go with that. The caring or the treatment and the travels to, say, the Barorona fish traps is a deep and an important story which talks about many things, including the health and well-being of the group, from the marriages that can happen there. And I've said that in the next paragraph, the kinship systems being strong but then strengthened by those sort of coming together based on that layer that I'm trying to present. So that's the work. Again, I'm just talking about broadly. I'll finish off with the mission and caring for country, the platform for truth-telling, as I tried to explain. And this is important, our 10D modelling, and I might, try to get this more clearly understood as a call to action, is in a sense a First Nations fight for social justice, to be really precise here. And there's always been, as Auntie said, that sovereignty has never been ceded. It's like, how do we start to look at the doctrine of terra nullius and show a way to demonstrate that there was complex First Nations land management practices. There was settlements in many places, permanent settlements in many places, and quite a lot of activities that related to how we operated in the land. And I think archaeology, and particularly virtual archaeology, has a way to represent that, to showcase that, to provide that evidence. And there's a need for our allies to work with us on, and many First Nations groups, to actually help that happen. Again, treaty negotiations, land rights claims, water rights disputes, the cultural mapping of cultural values and heritage onto the landscape is a way that we can, defend our claims in the Western legal and political systems, and done in a way that they can't dispute the role that First Nations people can play. And then finally, there's obviously this talk about how we can play a role in being a solution provider for climate change. But I think the 10D or the 10D dimensional approach is one way to show where we can act. where we can start to pinpoint a dot, a point, or a vector, an area, and then act in that regard. That's how that works in my mind. And then finally, towards sovereignty, this technological infrastructure. And this is where we come into these bigger questions. Once we start doing this and we open up this can of worms, we get into Indigenous data sovereignty questions. We get into care principles and that. So I want to be mindful of that. And that's what this Virtual Songlines website represents. And then, again, this next point I'm pointing out here is virtual sovereignty. This geospatial twin seeks to progress virtual heritage from a museum of the past into a living, immersive, and interactive virtual heritage twin of country. So this is not saying that we don't want to have museums or galleries putting our stuff on show behind glass cases, but I think there is a deeper now moment for First Nations people that they want to celebrate. We are here, we are surviving, and we are becoming more active in voicing our needs in that regard. So that's what this represents. And obviously, I think this then fosters a health well-being that is a deep multidimensional connection to country that can't be denied. So that's that part of it. Now that I've done that, I'll just this is where the rubber hits the road, I suppose, or the canoe hits the water, if it brings me into that. So this is the digital twin. All right, this is the landscape. In a sense, it's a Google Earth clone. And in that regard, it then starts to present all the different clans across the country. It does present every language as we work. And this is growing as we go. Now, every one of these virtual songlines icons is a project headed up by somebody in that location who's a community champion for that particular area. So even though I'm the one championing this web presence at this event, I'm just a messenger. I'm the messenger. It's actually working with those people, local people, to do this. Here's just to keep in the theme of Auntie who spoke. This is the NAM project for Melbourne, and from there, this plays, and I'll let people play this at their own time, but it might just be a bit laggy. But this, every moment opens up to a full screen and then plays a digital version of that. All up, I have 21,000 short videos. I think 21,000 might be more, but it starts with your photo. I'll let it play. So that is one short video, but if you look through this site, you'll see quite a lot of markers, and also place names. So that personifies the place naming scenario as well as the site scenario. And I believe if you come into here, many of these have got a digital download or that you could get hold of, and I think they're available at the moment, and that's available for anybody to explore these works. I think there's probably 40 or 50 links to those, so they're not all live, but that gives you an idea what's out there and available. Coming back out of this, and if I zoom back out, there's quite a lot of layers here. So if I zoom in and zoom out, if you did, you'll see various subjects being explored. This one here, if you get into this sort of icon, this represents the cultural or the colonial frontier wars, and that then shows that event and details on that as it works, as told by the perpetrators of those acts. Right, but down here, there's an icon here to a First Nations media producer who did his own podcasts of these events, and so you can read both. You can listen to both sides of the equation from that perspective. We want to, work with our allies as well as that. So that's that part of it. If you come along here again, I showed you. This is where the languages are now represented, where you can actually listen to local language words. These are just simply a word diary for that, which pertinent to that area. What we're going to do with this is take this into phrases, and then put those phrases into what we call virtual custodians in that project, in each project. And furthermore, if you come back out and you reset out, there's coming back, there's obviously some projects that are relevant to certain events, and this is where we're looking at projects like infrastructure projects that are happening, and then embedding Indigenous perspectives into those sites where these might be happening. This is the Western Sydney Airport, but there's many of these going on around the country. I think all up, there's 250 infrastructure projects in the state of Queensland alone that we want to do a virtual heritage assessment with the local people about that site, so they can actually have a say about their connection to country whilst that infrastructure project might be progressing. It's not a veto of that event happening, it's just the fact that they want to recognise that if I go back to Auntie Georgina, sovereignty's never been ceded. This is our country, this is our land, these are the heritage values pertaining to this. Up here, we've also got sites of significance across this. This is a very detailed version. These ones here are relevant to names that are coming out of quite a few archaeological reports. That's why they're given a big marker like that. So they're just basically that. And we are slowly ingesting, where we've got permission, every archaeological report ever written and drawn that has a mapping of sites of significance across the country into this registry. This is not to say that this registry doesn't exist within the state archives of any of the states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, but what we're trying to do here is decentralise that and give those sites, the references to those sites, back to traditional owners to have so they can be the custodians of their virtual heritage. I think that's a worthwhile cause, because it is, in a sense, their stories. I don't think it is stories for others to actually have carriage of. So that's where that goes. Again, we are just the custodians of that. And coming along here, we're then starting to talk about those groups that are looking to, I suppose, you could say, if I bring that right back up, commercialise their interests. So we're talking to a gentleman up here called Johnny Jaramali. He's a rock art expert, and I'm just bring that back a bit and just play that one again.
Supporting former passengers travelling with getting support mostly and 10 on PX. The PX for service to more than 40 gate 82.
So that's Jaramali, and at the moment we're slowly working through the representation of 72 groups like that who are celebrating their connection to country in such a way. This rock art, I think, has been explored at length by a Griffith University Emirates professor whose name just escapes me. I know him well, but I've forgotten his name. I wasn't sure about talking about him, so sorry for not having it in my mind. But I'm sure if anybody explores the most famous rock art expert in Australia, you'll know who I'm talking about. So that's that part of it, and if you come back out, that's the work. Now, in effect, what we're trying to do here, if I in a nutshell, and just to close off, I'm going to finish off in a minute. This particular work we're doing here is basically a Google Earth clone, in effect. That's really what it's about, but we're only focusing on the continent of Australia. And I'd like to also look at a layer here in time that would show you Saul, which is the name for Australia to the edge of the continental shelf when the ocean levels are much lower. And from that perspective, we'll be doing some more particular work. Keep watching this moment, because shortly we'll be doing songlines. In a sense, all the major songlines. We'll actually have a link to that. If I bring this up, you can see there's quite a lot of searching here you can do across the light. So it's a cultural heritage site only focused on that. But if I come into sort of natural features or say objects of cultural value, sacred ceremony places, this is where this goes. If I pick the Seven Sisters, that's a cosmology story, but there's also a songlines that goes with it, and it also was a celebration of sorts that was presented at the National Museum of Australia a while back there. The Emu of the Sky might be something that many of you might know about as a constellation of stars. It might be the stars of Orion, but the Emu of the Sky has a very important story relevant to how people might use or attend to the land based on that movement or where it might be in the sky at a certain time of year. If you watch our stars here, they'll move according to the rotation of the stars in the skies. It's an accurate rendition, and we want to demonstrate that through this work. This is a very complex site. You can spend, I would say, too much time than you'd imagine. So it's a very bold, ambitious work, but that's what we're trying to do here. Having shown you that timeline stuff, I'll just show you one particular part of this. This is not yet finished. This has got to be addressed. I don't think this is the way we want to demonstrate the timeline, but this is a digital representation of Cook's journey to Australia, and I'll just show you that little boat there. We can do any number of these 3D objects, and if I zoom in, you'll see his trip and everywhere it went. So again, showing you this is another way we want to demonstrate from a First Nations perspective the journey of Cook to Australia and where he went. He didn't cross land there. He went around that edge of the world there, but looked like he went over it. But having said this, if you look here, it's time-based. We've got that working, and very slow through there, if you remember that area there, because he was observing the I think the transition of Venus across the stars there at that point, and then also trying to avoid the reef, hitting the reef. Not sure where he went up there for, but that was his journey. might have been an island. This is his traverse of New Zealand and all that went with it. There's lots of stories to be said about that, but we've got some in there. I think we had something going on there with that lost map. But that's that journey. I'll just go around here. I've got a couple of minutes before I stop. But that, I wanted to get to the mainland here and show you Port Hicks. But we want to show this particular journey, not to show him as an explorer, but the First Nations perspectives of this. And I was looking at these being done, and I haven't yet talked everybody along this journey to know precisely what that was. But Stingray Bay, there's a lot of stuff that goes with this, and there's also an experience in that Botany Bay discussion that we need to do. But that gives you an idea of that. Let me just stop that. I won't go more. That's 1770, and I'll stop sharing this screen from here, and I'll bring it back to the organisers and see what we can do. There's my talk. Thank you for your time, and hopefully I can answer some questions before I have to jump on a plane to Morocco.